Welcome to the debate. So, you run a marathon, right? Your muscles get these micro tears, your glycogen completely depletes, and eventually you collapse. The math of physical fatigue is, well, it's incredibly simple and visible. Input minus output equals exhaustion.
Right, exactly.
But what happens when you spend, say, 45 minutes having coffee with a highly demanding, subtly manipulative person? You haven't lifted a single thing heavier than your ceramic mug, and yet you walk away feeling like you've been hit by a literal freight train.
Oh, I know that feeling. And if you are listening to this and wondering why you feel like you need a 3-hour nap after simply talking to a specific family member or boss, this is the exact phenomenon we are decoding today. We're looking at the source material surrounding chronic emotional exhaustion, specifically the debilitating depletion we experience around covertly toxic individuals.
Yeah, and the fascinating tension in the material is what is actually happening inside the body and the mind during these interactions. Because looking at the data, I see a clear psychological resource strain. I'll be arguing from the perspective of ego depletion theory and Bowen family systems. As a behavioral profiler, I posit that this exhaustion is fundamentally a depletion of finite cognitive resources. You are dealing with predatory personalities, covert narcissists who use pity and passive aggression to actively extract your volition.
And looking at the exact same material, I see a purely neurosomatic survival response. As a trauma-informed therapist, I have to argue that the whole energy vampire metaphor is, well, it's culturally popular but scientifically misleading. I draw on polyvagal theory to demonstrate that this isn't a loss of psychological energy. It's an automatic physiological drop into dorsal vagal shutdown, driven entirely by the nervous system's reaction to a systemic, invisible threat.
All right, well, to understand the psychological drain, we have to look at the mechanics of self-control. Human volition and affect regulation operate on an energy model. Roy Baumeister's ego depletion theory, it demonstrates that self-control acts precisely like a muscle.
Supposedly acts like a muscle.
Well, yes, when you use it, it fatigues. So managing a covert narcissist is it's like running a massive corrupted software update in the background of your smartphone. You might be sitting completely still, smiling, nodding along to their subtly degrading comments. You aren't doing anything on the surface, but your battery is plunging, the processor is overheating because all of your psychological RAM is being used to predict and manage this person's calculated behavior.
But see, the problem with the smartphone RAM analogy is that it implies a literal depletable resource. It assumes we have this bucket of cognitive fuel, and the narcissist just reaches in and empties it. And we have to address the elephant in the room regarding the source material here.
The replication trials.
Exactly. Recent multi-site replication trials have shown the effect size of Baumeister's ego depletion to be near zero. The idea that we have a literal tank of willpower that gets drained, it has been severely undermined in modern psychological research.
I completely disagree that the conceptual truth of the model is dead just because some localized laboratory tasks failed to replicate. Let's look at the classic studies highlighted in the material. Participants had to watch a highly evocative movie about a mother dying of cancer, right? And they were instructed to completely stifle and suppress their emotional reactions.
Yes, the suppression group.
Right. Afterward, those participants performed significantly worse on solvable anagram puzzles than those who just let their emotions flow. The mechanism here is vital for profiling these interactions. Regulating your emotions takes immense cognitive work. If you are sitting across from a covert narcissist playing the victim, someone who weaponizes guilt and catastrophizes every minor inconvenience to command the room, you are spending all your cognitive currency trying to stay calm and objective. Once that mental bandwidth is spent, you have no volition left for your own life.
I understand the appeal of the empty bank account analogy, I really do, but it completely contradicts the physical presentation of the victim's exhaustion. Let's look at how people actually feel when they walk away from these covert manipulations. They feel drained, but they don't just feel peacefully empty or pleasantly tired, like after a long hike. They consistently report a state of being collapsed but wired. They feel incredibly heavy, their brain is foggy, they might even feel disassociated. Yet their jaw is clenched, their stomach is in knots. If the tank is simply empty, as you suggest, where is all that residual buzzing tension coming from?
Well, the tension is the byproduct of the cognitive friction. It is the effort of trying to maintain a psychological boundary when your resources are already gone. You're running the engine on fumes, and the engine is knocking.
No, the tension is there because this is an active defensive state. It's not a passive absence of fuel. It is an active biological braking system. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory explains this perfectly. When we interact with someone who is constantly dropping micro insults or covert gaslighting, our nervous system unconsciously scans for danger.
Neuroception.
Exactly, neuroception. It happens entirely below conscious thought. And if that psychological threat feels too overwhelming for your sympathetic nervous system to fight or flee, because, you can't just punch your boss or scream at your spouse in a restaurant, your body drops into the oldest evolutionary defense mechanism we have, the dorsal vagal pathway.
So you are saying the body literally thinks it is dying during a passive-aggressive conversation?
Biologically speaking, yes. It perceives an inescapable threat. The dorsal vagal complex actively decreases your heart rate, alters your breathing, and overrides the fight or flight energy. It forces your physiology into a state of frozen agitation to protect you. That heaviness, the brain fog, that isn't a lack of fuel. Those are the neurochemical consequences of your vagus nerve actively suppressing your life force.
I have to push back hard on that biological framing.
Why? It perfectly describes the somatic reality of walking on eggshells.
Because if this were purely an internal braking system reacting to general stress, it wouldn't be so surgically specific to these predatory personalities. We cannot ignore the mechanics of exploitation in the text. Highly sensitive people, empaths in particular, they are actively targeted. Let's look at the covert tactics. Take weaponized incompetence.
Oh, a classic.
Right? They pretend they can't do a basic task, forcing you to step in. Or take the victim stance. This isn't depression, that's weaponized guilt. They use a passive-aggressive poor me routine to actively reject every logical solution you offer. This is a calculated, one-sided extraction of emotional validation. They are outsourcing their psychological regulation to you.
But you are framing this as this malicious mastermind extraction. The neurobiology suggests something far more automatic. Emotional contagion.
It is an extraction. Narcissistic supply is a real phenomenon.
I'm not denying the impact, but we possess an evolutionary mandate to co-regulate. We have a mirror neuron system that operates instantaneously. When you are exposed to someone else's simmering anger or their deep, unacknowledged insecurity, you automatically mimic their facial expressions, their vocal inflections.
Sure, humans mimic each other. But the level of exhaustion here goes way beyond simple mimicry.
Because for highly sensitive people, that affective resonance is turned all the way up. They absorb this suffering directly into their somatic tissues. It's a bi-directional link. The covert narcissist isn't magically reaching into your psyche and stealing cognitive RAM. They are a profoundly dysregulated system broadcasting chaotic noise. Your neuroception detects those threat cues, and you catch their emotional state the exact same way you catch a cold. It's empathic distress.
Okay, but see, the problem with that reading is that it completely fails to account for the specific behavioral triggers. Let's look at a real-world example. If it is purely an automatic biological mirroring of a dysregulated state, why do we not feel this toxic exhaustion around everyone who is highly emotional?
Well,
wait, let me finish this thought. If your best friend is experiencing genuine grief over a sudden divorce, and they are sobbing across the table, you might feel sad. You might feel tired later, but you do not feel that toxic, hollowed-out, mind-bending exhaustion. You feel compassion.
Because grief operates on a different neurobiological frequency than passive aggression.
No, it's because of the boundary violation. When a covert narcissist sits down at dinner and starts a sentence with, "You know what your problem is," or gives you the silent treatment for 3 days, that is an active attempt to dictate your reality. That instantly triggers the exhaustion. It is the psychological manipulation, the forcing of their distorted reality onto you that causes the drain. Bowen Family Systems explains this perfectly through the concept of differentiation of self.
All right, let's define that. because differentiation means a lot of things depending on the therapeutic context.
Think of differentiation of self as your psychological immune system. It's your ability to know exactly where your thoughts and feelings end and where another person's begin. A person with high differentiation can stay engaged without fusing with the other person.
So how does the lack of it cause physical exhaustion?
Because the exploitative person uses covert gaslighting and boundary testing to demand enmeshment, they want you to conform to their emotional reality to stabilize their own fragile ego. You are spending immense cognitive effort trying to maintain your own identity, your I position, against a predator who is demanding that you fuse with them. That is exactly why situational grief from a healthy friend doesn't drain you in the same way. The grieving friend isn't trying to extract your identity.
Look, I absolutely agree that boundary violations are devastating. But you are still treating the body as a secondary player to the intellect. The physical body is not just a meat sack carrying the brain around while the brain does all the important boundary work. And this distinction is paramount when we look at the path to recovery in the source material.
How so?
Because if we follow your psychological resource model, the solution you arrive at is purely cognitive. You just erect cognitive boundaries to stop the exploitation, right?
Exactly. The literature strongly supports relational containment and pattern interrupts. The primary tool here is the gray rock method. It's brilliant for dealing with covert narcissism.
And this is exactly where the purely psychological model falls apart and, frankly, becomes dangerous for the victim.
Wait, dangerous? Let me explain why gray rock works cognitively before you dismiss it. When you are forced to interact with a toxic individual, you provide short, factual, unopinionated responses. You withhold the emotional validation they are hunting for. You maintain a flat demeanor.
Right, you act like a boring gray rock.
Yes, and by doing this, you are actively starving the exploitative person of their dopamine reward. Covert narcissists rely on your emotional spike, your defense, your anger, to regulate their own nervous system. When you give them zero emotional data, the transaction fails. They get bored and move on. You separate your thoughts from their feelings, protecting your volition.
But see, this is exactly what trips victims up. The gray rock method might look like a success on the outside because the interaction ends, but it can be an absolute physiological disaster if deployed without somatic awareness.
How can protecting yourself socially and stopping a toxic extraction be a disaster?
Because you cannot simply think your way out of a physiological threat response. You cannot shame your nervous system into calming down with rigid cognitive rules. If you are sitting across from that covert narcissist, giving short, factual answers, acting perfectly flat on the outside, but internally your heart rate is 120 beats per minute, your jaw's clenched, and your stomach is in knots, you haven't actually established a boundary. You have just suppressed your expression of the trauma.
But you have stopped the predator's extraction. You've won the interaction.
At a massive internal cost. Your body is still trapped in a blended state of anxious shutdown. Your nervous system is still interpreting the person across the table as a mortal threat. And you are actively forcing your body to stay immobilized to maintain this gray rock facade. This is exactly the mechanism that leads to long-term health issues for victims: hypertension, autoimmune issues, chronic fatigue. Psychological boundaries completely fail to protect your sanity if the body remains trapped in dorsal vagal shutdown. The brain thinks it won while the body is taking catastrophic damage.
All right, so what is the alternative then? If you don't use cognitive boundaries to strategically shut down the manipulation, do you just succumb to it? Do you just let them gaslight you while you focus on your breathing?
No, of course not. You use somatic regulation first. You have to work the polyvagal ladder step by step. If you are in a dorsal vagal shutdown, that heavy, exhausted, walking on eggshells state, you cannot jump straight to calm, rational boundary setting. Your prefrontal cortex is effectively offline. Blood flow has literally shifted away from it. So you have to give the body gentle activation to move out of the freeze state.
What does that look like practically in the middle of a draining interaction?
It requires using physiological inputs to change the neurobiological state. You use temperature regulation, like stepping into the bathroom and splashing cold water on your face. That triggers the mammalian dive reflex, resetting the vagus nerve. You use gentle, rhythmic movement, like swaying or bilateral tapping on your legs under the desk, to signal to the nervous system that you are not paralyzed. You have to break the freeze.
And then what?
Only once you have mobilized out of the shutdown can you use extended exhales, breathing in for 4 counts and out for 8, to stimulate the parasympathetic branch and bring your heart rate down. You absolutely have to biologically signal safety to your body before your mind has the capacity to effectively enforce a boundary like gray rock.
I see the utility in that, I really do. But I would argue that somatic techniques, the splashing cooled water, the tapping, those are excellent acute interventions. They act as a biological band-aid.
A band-aid?
Yes, they treat the immediate symptom of the interaction. But if you do not understand the psychological framework of why you're being targeted by this specific personality, you'll just find yourself doing breathing exercises in the bathroom every single day forever. You're just managing the symptoms of a leaky boat instead of patching the hole.
Managing the nervous system isn't a band-aid. It is the foundation of reality. If your nervous system is dysregulated, you literally cannot patch the hole.
But you have to address the root cause, which is the predatory dynamic itself. Understanding Bowen family systems and the mechanics of these dark personalities allows you to recognize when your functional differentiation is sliding. It allows you to identify the covert tactics, the micro-insults, the silent treatment, in real time. If you don't have the cognitive architecture to recognize that someone is using pity to force enmeshment, no amount of deep breathing is going to stop them from doing it again tomorrow. You have to protect your personal volition logically.
I agree that understanding the toxic dynamic is vital. Identifying the invisible red flags is crucial for the victim. But I maintain that polyvagal theory provides the fundamental biological truth here. We are animals reacting to systemic threat cues. Somatic awareness is the only way to accurately read our own physiological state in real time. If you don't know whether your body is locked in fight or flight or collapsed in shutdown, you won't know how to survive the interaction. True resilience is built by expanding your nervous system's window of tolerance, not just building thicker, more rigid cognitive walls to hide behind.
Well, as we bring this debate to a close, I think it is clear that regardless of the underlying mechanism, whether we view it primarily as a calculated depletion of our finite psychological RAM by a covert predator or an evolutionary braking system triggered by unconscious threat, the phenomenon of chronic emotional exhaustion is a severe threat to our well-being. My position remains that recognizing the exploitative nature of these narcissistic patterns and establishing strong, differentiated cognitive boundaries is the bedrock of preserving our dignity.
And I maintain that without a trauma-informed, somatic approach to managing our autonomic nervous system, those cognitive boundaries will inevitably crumble under the sheer weight of physiological dysregulation. We must learn to listen to the body first. However, I think we converge on the reality that a comprehensive, lasting approach requires both frameworks. We have to identify the toxic, manipulative dynamics taking place across the table while simultaneously managing the very real biological trauma responses happening inside our own bodies.
I completely agree. There is so much more depth to this material, and we invite the listener to further examine these frameworks to determine which approach best illuminates their own relational stressors. Because, at the end of the day, emotional exhaustion isn't as simple as physical fatigue. You can't just rest your muscles to recover from a conversation that violated your reality. Sometimes the hardest marathon we ever run is simply sitting across the table from someone else, trying to keep our own self intact.